Hello, and welcome to Northward Nourish, an initiative promoting adaptive frameworks for sustainable agri-food transitions in communities living across Canada's remote north. In this episode, we will identify the nature and impacts of contemporary agri-food systems, address the drivers of northern food insecurity, explore what eating seasonally looks like for communities in the north, and finally, build a framework for promoting sustainable transitions in northern agri-food systems. What is meant by food sovereignty? How can we connect knowledge systems? And why is capacity building so critical to all of this? My name is Sage Brown, the person behind Northward Nourish and your host for this podcast episode. Throughout the episode, I will connect these topics, provide insight into the uniquely northern challenges faced by these remote communities, and leave you provided with the skills and knowledge needed to map sustainable transitions in northern agri-food systems. Together, I hope we may find the common ground required to build healthier, more equitable food systems for communities across the globe. Before I dive into this episode, I just want to give a bit more of an introduction about myself, as well as some of the things that inspired me to complete this research project. So like I said, my name is Sage. I'm an undergraduate student here at the University of Alberta in my final year of studies, completing a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology with a minor in the biological sciences. Over my years here, my interdisciplinary interests have grown in research areas ranging from environmental governance, human landscape interactions, as well as the impacts of climate change on northern systems. After enrolling in the University of Alberta's Certificate in Sustainability program, I knew that I really wanted to complete an integrative project that helped me encapsulate some of these interests. This brings us to the beginning of 2023, when I took a huge leap of faith and packed my bags to begin a study abroad term in Italy through the University of Alberta's school in Cortona. Although I was thoroughly intrigued by my studies, I became immersed entirely in the Tuscan culture, and it was here when my exposure to seasonal eating really first began. Throughout the time I spent living in Italy, I came to notice that the restaurant items, as well as the availability of products at local markets, shifted with the unfolding of the seasons. As April and the end of the semester approached, the piazzas in Cortona became vibrant centers of people enjoying the warmth of the sun and local markets filled with fresh citrus fruits and a variety of spring vegetables. After departing from Italy following the end of my exams, I ended up moving to the United Kingdom for work throughout the spring and early summer of 2023. During the time I spent living and engaging with the community members of the English countryside, I found myself exposed to a great deal of discourse surrounding the practice of seasonal eating as a way of living and eating more sustainably. From articles in local papers, recipes in food magazines, visits to the local farmers markets, and conversations with the many amazing people that I met and worked with while living there, seasonality seemed infused in and fundamental to the food practices in the region. As a lifetime foodie, an amateur chef, and an individual researching avenues for sustainable transitions, I found myself left considering how I could bridge the knowledge I had gained through my time living abroad in a meaningful way that would help promote food sovereignty across remote northern communities, including the one I call home. Immediately upon considering this, I was faced with the obvious question: how on earth could a region characterized by an average of 8 months snow cover, extremely low temperatures, and extensive permafrost possibly eat seasonally? Although environmental conditions pose barriers, even in consideration of the impacts of climate change to northern systems, in applying adaptive frameworks for seasonally guided agri-food transitions, I argue that communities in the north may gain food sovereignty. To accomplish this, efforts including capacity building, knowledge sharing, and coordinated action are essential to providing northern communities with the tools required to combat food insecurity and transition towards more sustainable food systems. Northward Nourish uses an interdisciplinary, system-based approach to address current conflicts in northern agri-food systems and builds an adaptive framework for northern communities seeking to navigate towards a sustainable, equitable, and locally guided food system. Before we may begin to explore northern food systems transitions, it is critical to understand the downfalls of contemporary food systems and how their structure works to perpetuate food insecurity across the remote north. Taken cumulatively, the impacts of contemporary industrial-scale agricultural practices are understood to be extremely detrimental to the health of global ecosystems. These environmental impacts include the contamination of land and water resources, habitat fragmentation, biodiversity loss, as well as significant greenhouse gas emissions resulting from industry activities. Furthermore, monocultural practices are understood to be contributing to the loss of both dietary diversity and the decreased genetic resilience of crop species. With globalization, communities across the world are developing increased reliances on long international supply chains for essential goods and services. As one might suspect, the greater distance between sites of production and consumption, the greater the energy requirements associated with the transportation of these goods. Through this, food items acquire significant levels of embedded carbon which are left unaccounted for, and this is particularly the case with fresh produce items, including fruits and vegetables. Capitalist accounting frameworks fail to incorporate the many external costs associated with global agri-food systems, including the loss of biodiversity, air pollution, worker safety, quality of life, and access to safe, habitable areas. Additional issues include the concentration of system power in the hands of corporate retailers. These entities hold significant influence over the nature of agri-food practices, industry standards, and the development of industry policies and legislation. Although current output levels from industrial agri-food practices are sufficient to meet the dietary requirements of the global population, the uneven distribution of food items results in the perpetuation of food insecurity, malnutrition, and starvation. But with all of that said, we must recognize the role of international networks of trade and distribution in providing essential goods and services to billions of people across the globe. And although contemporary food systems negatively impact global ecosystems, further contributing to climate change, global agriculture is also becoming increasingly impacted by rapid climate-induced changes such as increased global temperatures, changes in the duration of growing seasons, and the increased frequency of extreme weather events. Having briefly reviewed some of the adverse impacts resulting from industrial agri-food systems, it is evident that the nature of our food systems are in need of significant reframing. So having understood that contemporary agri-food systems do not meet sustainable criteria, what features might characterize a food system as sustainable? In the broadest sense, a sustainable food system is one that meets the demands of food security and nutrition while also meeting the requirements of social, environmental, and economic sustainability. A food system of this nature ensures the protection of food security and environmental systems for the generations to come. Alternatively, two indicative signs of a food system that is unsustainable include the existence of pervasive food insecurity and malnutrition. Across communities in the North, levels of household food insecurity are significantly higher when compared against the national average in Canada. Furthermore, many northern residents lack access to adequate supply, diversity, and quality of nutritious food items, particularly fresh fruits and vegetables. Based on this knowledge, we can support an argument that the nature of northern agri-food systems fails to meet the criteria of a sustainable food system. From my own experience as someone who grew up in the Yukon and witnessed the impact of supply chain vulnerability on the distribution of food to the north, I was aware that northern communities were faced with a unique set of challenges associated with living in remote areas. Despite this, the further I embarked into my research project, I began to appreciate the disproportionate burden placed on communities living in the north who are working tirelessly to build more sustainable futures for both themselves and future generations. To identify the tools required for sustainable transitions in northern agri-food systems, it is critical we understand the underlying mechanisms responsible for extreme rates of food insecurity in communities across northern Canada. In a 2023 article published in Rural Sociology, a team of researchers found rates of food insecurity in the Northwest Territories to be nearly twice the national average. To understand some of the major drivers of this systemic human rights issue, I was able to summarize and identify three dominant causes of northern food insecurity. These include inefficient and poorly developed transportation routes, poor quality of imported food goods, as well as the high cost of food items in retail outlets. To begin, inefficient transportation routes required to provide essential goods and services can be understood as an issue of supply chain vulnerability. Access to and the cost of food items in the north are particularly sensitive to supply chain issues, road access, wildfires, and ice road stability. When paired with increased northern road closures due to wildfires and ice road instability with climate change, we begin to understand just how critical it is we begin strengthening the resilience of localized infrastructure in northern regions. Secondly, unreliable delivery times often result in the quality of food items being compromised by the time they reach consumers in the north, particularly fruits and vegetables. This works to fuel distrust in the capacity of current systems and further contributes to global food waste. These damaged goods fail to meet the nutritional needs of northern residents. Access to high-quality, fresh produce has been demonstrated to reduce the risk of health-related issues, including coronary heart disease, strokes, and even some cancers. Even when available, these food items often come at a significantly higher cost and are unaffordable to many northern residents. This brings us to our third driver of northern food insecurity, which is the high cost of food items. Costs of transportation of food goods to northern communities are oftentimes reflected in their retail prices. Particularly pronounced in extremely remote communities, such as the community of Old Crow in the northern Yukon, a 2019 study published in Canadian Food Studies found costs increases as high as 20% to account for the cost of transportation. With essential food items in low availability, poor quality, and unaffordable to many northern residents, individuals are forced to purchase a higher proportion of low-cost, perishable food items that are significantly lower in nutritional value. Combined, these issues work to illustrate the severity of existing food insecurity and the failure of current agri-food systems to provide items essential to sustaining communities living across northern Canada. As knowledge networks continue to develop in northern communities, incentives for finding tangible solutions to help decrease the reliance on imported food items has become an increasingly significant priority. I suppose in some ways a silver lining can be found in that this widespread issue provides a common ground for communities to build adaptive northern-specific strategies and frameworks to provide sustainable agri-food transitions. In this next section, we will transition our focus from identifying the issues to exploring theoretical frameworks for northern sustainable food systems. In an effort to combat food insecurity, many communities across the north are now turning towards greenhouses and community gardens to help offset the high cost of living. These efforts promote food sovereignty through deconcentrating and diversifying food supplies in northern Canada. Community-led projects, including the Trondek Teaching and Working Farm in the Yukon Territory, as well as the Inuvik Community Gardens in the Northwest Territories, have been extremely successful, particularly in recent years. In addition to increasing access to locally grown produce, these efforts have blossomed into arenas for promoting education and awareness. Working to alleviate feelings of helplessness and anxiety stemming from high rates of food insecurity, they provide spaces for technical training and skill development surrounding sustainable, healthy food systems. A 2019 article published in Canadian Food Studies found that individuals participating in these efforts consume significantly higher quantities of fresh produce, allowing them to meet national dietary intake recommendations. The overall success of these projects and their demonstrated capacities to help address issues of food insecurity has led to increased demand for locally produced food items and infrastructural investments. Throughout this episode, I have used the term food sovereignty extensively, so let us now unpack what this term entails in the context of Canada's North. As a concept, food sovereignty stretches far beyond equal access. It is about building relationships with the land and the food we are eating. The National Farmers Union of Canada defined food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. While capitalist food systems are guided by productivist models reliant on cheap labor, privatized land grabs, and the continued degradation of natural systems, guiding principles of food sovereignty include the building of knowledge networks, improving local livelihoods, addressing food insecurity, and breaking dependencies on external inputs through the shortening of supply chain. Food is a fundamental way in which humans are connected to the land and its resources. Agroecological frameworks use principles of food sovereignty to bridge the gap between food, sustainability, cultural relationships, equitable livelihoods, and access to essential resources. Working with, rather than against nature, agroecological approaches are contextual and built on the lived experience and knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples across the globe. These agricultural approaches ensure efforts are taken to improve the quality of natural areas and place emphasis on the long-term health and well-being of both natural and cultural systems. These approaches demonstrate that healthy lands sustain healthy people, further underlying the critical role of land stewardship that extends far beyond the management of sustainable resource consumption. Agroecology in Canada is fundamentally linked to Indigenous sovereignty and land rights. The loss of traditional lands across Canada, essential to both cultural and subsistent activities since time immemorial, has resulted in the creation of dependencies on federal, provincial, and territorial governments for access to food products and other essential services. We must understand that contemporary Canadian food systems are born out of colonialism, and as such, achieving food sovereignty requires that action is taken to return traditional lands to Indigenous communities, as well as to give recognition to the validity and diversity of Indigenous knowledge systems in Canada. Sovereignty over food systems for Northern communities is fundamental to tackling the socio-political dimensions of sustainable food systems transformations across the North. With this knowledge, what meaningful actions can be taken by Northern communities to gain food sovereignty? Through my research, I found that in the context of Northern communities in Canada, achieving food sovereignty can be done through 3 meaningful routes. These include knowledge sharing, capacity building, and seasonally informed patterns of consumption. The first avenue of food sovereignty we'll explore is the role of knowledge sharing. Events ranging from community meetings, workshops, academic conferences, cultural ceremonies, and policy forums allow communities to come together and share skills and knowledge. Increased frequency of such events yields significant promise of increasing local engagement and facilitating the communitive networks required for the development of targeted policies. Increased demand for investments in Northern agriculture exists as an opportunity for the co-design and co-management of sustainable food systems. Essential knowledge required to sustain Northern agricultural efforts includes both horticultural knowledge, such as the identification and treatment of nutritional deficiencies in crop items, as well as technical skills ranging from propagation, transplantation, and harvesting practices. Secondly, capacity building works to promote food sovereignty through strengthening the resilience of Northern communities by decreasing reliances on global supply chains. Among the first localized initiatives working to combat Northern food insecurity, community gardens and greenhouses continue to become critical centers for community engagement and skill development. Additionally, grower cooperatives are understood to be essential to unifying regional farmers, infrastructure, storage facilities, and equipment. The success of Northern agricultural efforts has increased pride in local farmers who are working to uplift their communities, in doing so providing them with increased autonomy and decision-making power. When taken combined, the role of knowledge sharing and capacity building provide Northern residents with the opportunity to address food insecurity, to create opportunities for employment, build and strengthen local relationships, guide sustainable development, and to promote food sovereignty. Although Northern agricultural sectors are forecast to undergo continued expansion in the decades to come, given significant climatic limitations, most notably low mean annual temperatures and short growing seasons, it is unlikely that Northern communities will be able to become entirely self-sufficient. This brings us to our third route for promoting food sovereignty in Canada's North. Seasonally guided patterns of consumption provide Northern residents with the ability to make sustainable food choices that maximize the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of their food items. Recognizing that environmental constraints prevent Northern communities in Canada from producing their own food year-round, Northern residents require approaches to sustainable consumption that combine imported and locally produced food items. In the context of Northern Canada, supermarkets are the only outlet capable of providing access to fruits and vegetables year-round. Levels of consumption of fresh produce has been demonstrated to be strongly dictated by their availability and price, as well as the amount of shelf space allocated in supermarket settings. Seasonal variation in price is well documented across both wholesale and retail venues. Seasonal price fluctuations work to deal with supply chain issues, shortages, and the cost of transportation. When in season, fresh produce items have a higher nutritional value and are often highly abundant when compared to those forcibly cultivated outside of their natural growing season. The high abundance of in-season food items allows for the drop in their retail prices. A 2015 study published in Public Health and Nutrition found that across farmers markets, roadside stands, and conventional supermarket settings, there was a demonstrated trend in peak season product price lowering. Additional benefits to eating seasonally include maximizing the nutritional value of consumed food items, increasing the diversity of one's diet, the maintenance of a healthy gut microbiome, and reconnecting with the natural rhythms of global ecosystems. In knowing when and where to access locally produced food items and developing user-friendly guides for eating seasonally abundant food items when local goods become unavailable, Northern residents will be better equipped to exercise their purchasing power as consumers and to eat in a way that supports both local and global food sustainability. The impact of contemporary agri-food systems on issues of social justice, health, and the environmental crisis at hand can no longer be dismissed. Addressing the complex barriers facing sustainable agricultural transitions in northern communities requires dynamic approaches that are embedded in the goals of northern communities seeking to achieve food sovereignty. Before concluding this episode, I would like to provide some closing insights on the continued agricultural expansion unfolding across Canada's north. Historically, agricultural activities across Canada's northern territories have occurred at low levels, resulting in an absence of policies and industry regulations that are essential to guiding the growing number of agricultural projects developing across the north. Although policy development is contentiously debated, and rightly so, strong policies are also critical to ensuring the protection of public health and safety and to guide environmentally sound practices. Systems-based approaches enable policymakers, industry representatives, and researchers to collaborate more effectively towards sustainable transitions through better understanding the interconnection nature of human socioeconomic and biophysical systems. These approaches allow for the development of sound policies and legislation, acknowledge the link between social, ecological, and industrial systems, and highlight systems interactions as well as their unintended consequences. For our purposes, the adoption of system-based approaches better encapsulates global agri-food system complexity and how systems in place impact the capacities of northern communities working to build more sustainable food systems. It is critical to note and recognize that communities across the north are not homogeneous, nor are their particular environmental, cultural, or socio-political circumstances. Each approach taken to sustainable agri-food transitions in northern communities must first begin with an examination of the existing issues at the local level. To those of you who have made it this far, I would like to extend my gratitude for taking the time to tune into my episode today to learn more about northern food systems and northern food systems transformations. If, like me, you are passionate about food and sustainability, I am beyond excited to announce the launch of my website, Northward Nourish. Using this platform, I hope to continue to publish informative content on sustainable food practices, provide seasonally guided and delicious recipes, as well as spotlights on current action being taken by communities across the north. In providing access to knowledge and digital spaces facilitating community connections, I hope to bridge my research in a meaningful way through providing fellow northern residents and other people interested in food systems transformations with another tool in their kit to help mobilize local coordinated action required for sustainable food systems transformations. I would also like to extend my thanks to the continued support of my project supervisor, Dr. Hernandez Ramirez, to our academic sustainability coordinator, April Bergstrom, for overseeing the many integrative projects of students enrolled in the certificate program, and to the great many professors and researchers whose work fueled this project. To my powerhouse parents, whose unyielding commitment to environmentalism will forever make them my heroes. And finally, to my roommate, Julia Romano, for making all of this possible by letting me borrow her microphone to record this episode. To stay updated on the progression of Northward Nourish, again, you can head to www.northwardnourish.com for continued insights into northern food systems, sustainable development, or at the very least, to check out some very tasty, seasonally informed recipes. Together, I hope we may continue to build and envision adaptive frameworks for ensuring the sustainability of human cultural and biophysical systems for our generation as well as the generations to come.